All right, folks, it's Healthcare Unfiltered. We have two folks who are returning again to the show. I think that you guys just learn your lessons and just stop coming back on the show, but I'm very persistent. It took about 2 months to schedule this meeting, by the way, this podcast, but that tells me how busy these two amazing colleagues and friends are. So welcome to the show, Sanam and Amer.
Thank you so much
Uh,
for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
So
Always a
Sanam, maybe there are
pleasure.
a few people who don't know where you work and what you do. Maybe quick intro.
Sure, I'm Sanam Loghavi. I'm a hematopathologist and a molecular pathologist at MD Anderson in Houston, Texas.
And Amer.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Amer Zeidan. I'm the chief of the Hematologic Malignancies Division at Yale Cancer Center, and building behind me is the Ancient School of Medicine, which at Yale, hopefully guys
Nice.
get to visit.
Yeah, behind me is all of my attempts to market myself with two books and a podcast. And I hate to tell you guys, I just got I have a third book gonna come next year, so stay
Oh
tuned.
my gosh,
I know, and it's crazy, let me tell you. But today's podcast is not about me or my books or my podcast. It's about you and what in the world are you guys doing in the world of classifying lymphoma and leukemia. So I've actually taped a podcast over a year ago, and Sanam was on that podcast. We were talking about the classifications of lymphoid and myeloid malignancies and how there's like a lot of different classification, blah blah. So Sanam, take us back to that time, just a bit back to that time. I want to understand, not today, a year or 2 years ago when this started, and I want to try understand from Amir after this what was the implication clinically of that classification? Because we heard a lot of people who were dissatisfied.
yeah. So, you just mentioning the podcast took me back in time, and it's hard to believe that it's been actually 3 years
Oh
since
my
these
God,
classifications were published, right? Because they came,
22.
so if you remember, the blood paper with the ICC was published in June of 2022, and the leukemia paper with the WHO classification was published in July of 2022. So almost 3 years ago now, which is insane. But time flies when you're having fun classifying the
Absolutely.
but so that I don't really know about the history or the politics or what happened that led to, I mean, I know things, but it's just secondhand information that, but I don't want to speculate, but I think what happened is that there was a disagreement between the leadership of the WHO at the time and the authors of the previous edition of the WHO, and the way they wanted to structure the things, the timelines, deadlines. And so the WHO elected to, come up with with the new classification, consulting other authors, bringing in, other authors and experts to advise the classification. And then the former authors of the fourth edition, the revised fourth edition of the WHO, they got together and formed what is now called the ICC, so International Classification, Consensus Classification, so International Consensus Classification. And that was published in the Blood paper that came out in June 2022. And then later followed by a book. And the WHO book, also there's a summary paper that was published in Leukemia in July of 2022, and followed by the Blue Book, which is, the essentially the accepted World Health classification system for hematopoietic malignancies. So I think, now having practiced and,
Were there much
applied,
differences though? Were there a
well, that's what I
lot of
want to tell you.
differences?
Having applied both classification, because, at the time there was a lot of, for good reason, a lot of heartache and fury about like, why do we have two classifications? This is crazy. This is bad for patient care. And I think a lot of it is absolutely true. But the consensus among the hematopathology community was that we're going to provide both. We're going to provide both classifications when there is a difference. And I'll tell you that, for the most part, both classifications overlap a lot because both groups tried to take existing data to come up with the classification systems, right? So it's not like they made it up. It was based on data. However, it's not 100% the same, because there were areas where there were gaps in the knowledge that we had. There were, the data was insufficient to come up with concrete numbers or percentages or, variant allele frequencies. And so those are the areas that I think, people got creative and used their expertise and came up with consensus, opinions and guidelines, and put it in the books and in the two classification systems. So there's minor, at least in the myeloid world, there is minor discrepancies. I think the most important one is the recognition of the MDS/AML category by the ICC, and then the way TP53 mutated neoplasms are classified in the ICC and not in the WHO. So again, having now practiced 3 years and applying both classification systems, it's very clear to me that there is, the ICC did some things better and the WHO did some things better.
Mm-hmm.
Neither are perfect, but I think, combining them and hopefully having a unified classification, which is what we're going to talk about, is the way to go. But I do think that these, minor discrepancies that existed in these two classifications really led to people in the field looking at these discrepancies and using objective data to try to, come up with which one is better than the other. A lot of it led by, like for MDS by ICMDS, led by Amer, Rami, people, in the MDS world, and similar with AML. So I think there's now concrete data that can be used to inform the future classification that, will address these discrepancies.
Amer, take me back also to these couple of years ago, 22, and when this happened. These two classifications came on clinically. From a clinical perspective, were you affected how you made decisions based on these two classifications? Did this affect clinical care at Confusion, or was it just simply academic, I guess, dialogue, but did not impact clinical care?
Yeah, no, I think all of these are very good points. I actually remember very well when this came, because it happened. So the International Consortium for MDS was actually established in June 2022. So when these two papers came back to back within, which is amazing, by the way, like to have two classifications, but they came concurrently, which tells you that the two groups were kind of going in a speed race to kind of who gets their paper out. Anyway, so this came just before that meeting, and we had actually a very intense discussion during that meeting about the two classifications and the differences. And I remember Dr. Haserjian kind of on the podium, and I do not envy him back then, because I think everybody, like all the clinicians, were very unhappy with kind of this new kind of division. And I think largely because of the way I think of classifications really as a common language, right? This is how pathologists speak to clinicians, how we speak to regulatory agencies when we approve drugs, how we design trials, how we speak to patients about their diseases. So you really need to have a common language. I mean, when you have more than language, it gets confusing. I think the second point, what kind of, in all honesty, kind of irritated many of us, is that we were getting this line, well, the two classifications were very similar, almost 90% overlapping, a little bit of a difference. And why do you need to have two classifications if they are like overlapping by 90%? But I think this, as Sanam said, this had led to, I think, good things, including, I think, attempts at clarifying some small, rare entities. I think both of those classifications emphasize and I'm going to talk more about the myeloid side because this is where I'm more familiar. Both of them emphasize kind of the genetic and molecular aspects over the biology, over the morphologic aspects, which all of us were already kind of feeling that this is very important, like creating a new TP53 entity, which was not described as an entity before in MDS. But the problem is that each system used slightly different definitions, and it was confusing again in terms of when people talk about TP53, which system were they kind of referring to? But your main question about how does that impacted the clinic? I mean, in all honesty, the main difference is it caused us to spend more time with patients because the patients were getting confused. And, these days, over the last few years, there was this law that was passed by Congress where records get immediately released to patients. So the patients were getting the record, the path report, sometimes even before we see it. The minute it's signed, it's in the electronic system, they get an email that your path system is online. And sometimes the patients get confused for the reason that Sanam mentioned, is that when you use both systems, you can call the disease AML and MDS/AML, and the patient says, well, nobody told me I have AML, and then you have to explain to them, the whole idea of this biologic continuum. And while many of us kind of always apply this kind of judgment call about how do you approach the diseases, for some people, they need to have a black or white, right? Like the regulatory agencies, like they do not like this idea of continuum. They, this is either this or that. For patients, for insurance companies as well, that can cause some confusion. But I have to say again, ultimately, like Sanam said, this was more primarily an academic kind of discussion, maybe some nuisance in discussion with patients and agencies, but ultimately on clinical care, it really had minimal impact, I would say.
And I think that's important because, I mean, we can all agree standardization is important because you have to compare trials, papers, all of these things. But at the end of the day, what's really critical is that patients don't receive treatment that they wouldn't have needed because of the classification, or treatment is not withheld from them because of the classification. And my understanding, at least, you both are providing reassurance that this did not happen.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, for the most.
So, and the difference is, like you both mentioned, is really not that huge anyway. So what happened that was it like outcries that, let's get together? Like, Sanam, why did this change now 3 years later?
Yeah, so I think for all the reasons that we discussed, because there was a sense from both sides that this is really detrimental to the, to the patients, to the community. And, I think both parties put forth good faith and, decided to come together and propose a unified classification. And my understanding is that, what happened is, because, so you guys are probably not familiar with this, but in the hematopathology community, we have a Society for Hematopathology, which is a US-based organization. And then there is a European counterpart to Society of Hematopathology. So they're actually joint, they hold joint meetings. So it's the EAH4P, so European Association for Hematopathology. And so the presidents of both societies, I think, had discussions with the leaders of the WHO. So, and when I say, WHO, I mean like the big WHO agency, so IARC, right? And they came to this agreement that the Executive Committee for Society of Hematopathology and EAHP would select a certain number of, hemopath experts that would serve as a committee that would inform so there's now a committee that's called the Classification Advancement Meeting Committee. So these, there's a handful, or like maybe of a little bit over 10, I think 12, 13 experts that are chosen by the executive committee of the AHP and SH. And they are going to meet and they're going to, try to come up with guidelines and publish this in the format of a paper. And then the new classification, which is going to be the WHO 6th edition, is going to use those guidelines and data and invite authors and editors from both sides.
But what was the trigger, I guess? Amer, maybe you can, like, why? Like, it's been going on.
I think it's a constellation of things, including, again, wanting to do right by the patients, I think, most importantly. And then also because everybody in the community was unhappy, right? I think hematopathologists were unhappy because it was, it just created a lot more confusion and work. And I think clinicians, rightfully so, were very unhappy because, it just created, like Amer was saying, more time to describe, the differences or the discrepancies to the patients. You have to really educate, and I think one of the important things that we may not think about on a day-to-day basis is, it's not just the very savvy oncologist that's reading the reports and can read between the lines and, interpret these. Sometimes, there are data coordinators that are trying to enter these results into a database, that are trying to get a patient, screened for a trial. And I think the more complicated we make these reports, the harder we're making everybody's job, right?
Yeah.
So these were the reasons.
Yeah. So Amer, for myeloid, is there, with the new classification, can you tell us what are the differences? I mean, are there any? Is it just like we got together, this is what you use, the WHO, and or are there any drastic changes that occurred over the past 2 years?
So I think the main changes kind of carried forward in both classification, as Sanam was saying. I mean, there was a lot of overlap. So I think the main changes, for example, like there was a long list of genetic abnormalities that if you have now, you would be called acute myeloid leukemia, even if the blast count was not was not 20%, which is something that again has been kind of growing over time. For example, entities like NPM1 mutated myeloid diseases. Over time, we have been having an increasing body of evidence suggesting that those patients probably behave more like acute myeloid leukemia biologically and clinically, even if the blast count is less than 20%. Now, the nuisance is that, for example, the ICC requires 10% blast in everything to call it acute myeloid leukemia. Well, if you are less than 10%, it would not be technically acute myeloid leukemia. So if you have 8% blast and you had NPM1 in the WHO 2022, that would be AML. In the ICC, it would be, I believe, MDS, or I'm not even
MDS/AML, maybe. Huh?
Yeah, 8%.
No, actually,
I'm not sure.
8% would not. 8% would be MDS. Yeah.
Yeah, MDS would. So, again, I think many of us feel like, if you model that same exact patient in 3 weeks, probably the blast count are going to be above. So it's probably a transitional state. So again, I think some of these kind of, for example, it wasn't clear to me where the 10% cutoff exactly came. There's always have to be a cutoff, right? It could be 20%, could be 10%. But what we know in reality is that if you have 500 cells and you have different pathologists count them, there is like a, error around the mean standard deviation. So some person can come up with 8%, some person can come up with 12%. So these exact thresholds, while they are important from a kind of a pathological point of view, there is some degree of variation. And we knew that for a very long time. But I think at the end of the day, kind of coming back to the point that we started with, is that we know none of these classifications is perfect, right? So, and in my opinion, as you never let the perfect be, or perfect be the enemy of the good, as they say. So it never made sense to me that since we cannot have a perfect classification, why would you have more than one? Now, I think again, at one point, I heard an argument that there are, I guess in lymphoid tumors, there are multiple classifications historically, and it's only in myeloid we were lucky that we only had the WHO. We had the FAB, the French, American, British, but nobody used that for many years. And
it was my favorite, just for the record. The FAB was my...
Yeah, I love the FAB.
I kid you not, it was my absolute favorite classification. I'd like to go back to the FAB.
Yeah, but I think the WHO has been like the standard. And I was actually reviewing some protocols over the weekend. And again, I noticed in Europe, I think, again, for political reasons, like they tend to use the ICC more. So you could see that, that the protocols were saying acute myeloid leukemia according to the ICC 2022. So that could make differences in who can go on a protocol versus not. It could be minor differences. But I think ultimately, we really need to go back to one way of calling things.
So what I heard, we're going to go back to the WHO, correct? Like we're going back to the WHO edition 6 or something.
Right, but the WHO is going to be, the authors and the editors are going to be a mixture of the authors.
Mix of both. Okay. Okay, but it's going to come out as the WHO classification for lymphoid and myeloid malignancies.
Correct.
Okay.
I wanted to add like just 2 quick points, if you let me share.
Yeah,
One
yeah.
is one is I feel like the WHO has been beaten up so much in the last few years, and it has been kind of horrendous what they went through with with the COVID, and then with the removal of the funding from the US, and I think really they have been doing an outstanding job across the world in trying to unify the approach in many countries that have limited resources, etc. So I particularly feel strongly that they have led these kind of classifications for many years. And actually, I would add that the WHO, we live in the world of heme malignancies, but I think they have like 16 other kind of classifications, GU and lung and whatever. This issue came up only on the heme malignancy side. I don't think there was a split with the other tumors. And just the second point is that there is a lot of confusion about biology versus or about prognosis versus classification. And I think there was this increasing attempts to pack into the classification a lot of the things that you probably can get through other ways to count the prognosis of the patient. And I think that caused some confusion. So classification really is focused on putting biologic entities that are very similar, that share common pathogenesis together. So you study them together. It does not necessarily have to carry all the prognostic information. And this is why, for example, advanced pancreatic cancer with median survival of 6 months is different than TP53 AML with 6 months. So prognosis is only part of the equation. And I think this is very important to differentiate. So I'm hoping the new classifications are gonna again try to kind of do kind of the most important thing in helping us put diseases together in a way that makes more sense rather than trying to bring in too much prognosis into it.
So let's start with lymphoid malignancies, Sanam. I mean, I like the idea we're aligned and everybody is rowing in the same direction. Anything new there? Is it just realignment? And we have 60, 70, 80 types of lymphomas. Are we approaching 100, 120, 130? I mean,
oh my God, so many. I can't keep up with the lymphomas. So I think the differences in the lymphoid classifications were not as much as in the myeloid. There's the major differences that I'm aware of in the lymphoid world were the way the high-grade B-cell lymphomas were classified in the two, based on morphology and genetics, triple hit versus double hit. So there was some, differences there. And then the EBV positive lymphomas, the PT post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorders, there was some discrepancy there. But I think, again, the goal is, this CAM, or the classification advancement meeting, is going to include lymphoid experts from both sides as well. And so the hope and the intent is that there's going to be a uniform classification for lymphoid and myeloid neoplasms.
When do you expect to incorporate that in your reports?
The classification?
Yes.
Well, we haven't even met yet. So the first meeting.
But is this something like you meet today and it's tomorrow? Like, do you feel like, is there a lag time?
A process. Yeah, it's going to be a process. So the classification advancement meeting is going to, meet several times to come up with their guidelines, publish, the novel information, what's going to go into the class. But I think it's probably going to be at least, I think, a couple of years before we have an actual Oh, yeah.
2 years?
I think so.
No, I didn't hear that. Amer, please tell me she was just joking.
No, you should be happy that's actually happening. I mean, not all of us were very confident that it's actually what's going to happen. I mean, I can tell you, I think the field has to take credit, I think, in pushing this. I agree with Sanam that people wanted to do what's right by patients, but I have to be honest, I think both sides took a lot of heat from the clinicians and probably from different stakeholders. And again, I think there are other reasons why these two classifications came that related to personal issues and other things. I agree with Sanam that for the most part it was about different views, but we have we always have different views in any way to do any classification or response criteria. You have ways to which you can bridge any differences and reach a formal consensus on any process. So this should not have happened to begin with, in my opinion, and I think now at least we have a commitment from both parties and to kind of come into one way. But I think we can live another 2 years with this,
No,
as
no,
long
no.
as there's a clear.
And Shadi, I
There's
think
a
one of the things is that, as Amer was just saying, so the WHO is, the tumor classification system for all tumor types, right? And the update to the 5th edition, I think like the making the two classifications uniform is kind of a silver lining that's coming from the update of all the series, right? So the WHO updates their classification systems every 5, 10, depending on how much new information there is, years, right? So there is an update due for the WHO, and that will be the 6th edition. But then what's going to happen is it's going to be a joint classification by the two groups. So it's not that it's only being done to unify the classifications, right? It's just updating the classification system.
I mean, part of the reason I asked the question is I was trying to better understand the impact on new classification system on ongoing clinical trials. So I was trying in my mind, I was trying to think there must be some clinical trials ongoing that are using the classification from 2022. It's been 3 years. Some trials have been incepted since then. Now you get a new
class. Trials that incorporate FAB, like you
well,
have
right, but like with the new classification, do you do anything for ongoing studies, or I mean, Amer, or you just keep going?
No, actually, many of the studies are still using the 2016. And, when people were developing kind of protocols, they were coming to us. And this was part of that kind of confusion that happened after these came out, is that which classification should we use? And, as we were saying, I mean, there's a significant overlap. But I gave you an example with the NPM1, because that patient, if the protocol uses ICC versus WHO 2022, the patient could be included or excluded based on which classification is being used. So it does affect, I would say, maybe, I don't know, like 10-15% of patients, but for the most part, there is not going to be significant difference. I actually think that, again, since there is I don't want to say like disregard both 22 WHO and ICC, but I think since there's a plan to do the kind of the new one, I think many of the protocols are kind of going by the 2017 or just continue with what they have right now, and then ultimately they will transition. But I don't think you can change the way a protocol defines the disease halfway. You cannot go from 2017 to 22 or whatever comes next. What's going to happen is you'll have to look at the subgroups and retrospectively classify the patients, when you want to compare in the future. Okay, this is how, and we do this all the time. I don't think it's going to be a huge deal.
Yeah. So
sorry, Shadi. So, we're kind of used to this. Even if you look at the MDS world, the majority of the trials actually still use IPSS-R to screen patients and determine eligibility. It's not really IPSS-M, even though IPSS-M has been out for, I don't know, 2-3 years now, right? If not more.
Mm-hmm. So just over the past 3 years, you both on the hematopathology side, on the clinical side, have you been getting from your respective colleagues in the community who don't see as many diseases as you do? I mean, this is all you do day in and day out. I think that's an exception from the real world. Were you witnessing a level of confusion? Were you having to pick up people calling you and say, I don't understand this, whether it's pathologist, whether it is a clinician? I'll start with Amer and then Sanam. I mean, were you getting some calls where people just are not certain what to do because of the report?
Yeah, I think in the community, I don't think it made a huge difference for the community docs, because in all honesty, they call me, usually they say I have a patient with MDS AML. They don't even go to the level of like differentiating many times this MDS or AML. So I think this was primarily at the patient level where it has the most impact. I mean, as I said, it rarely affected our kind of clinical decision, because this is only a factor in clinical decision making, but it's primarily in the communication with the patients who sometimes, again, in their mind, like if I have AML, it's a disaster. If I have MDS, even if it's 19% plus versus 21, So some of these are things we have to explain to the patient anyway, but emotionally, for some reason that is not clear to me, some patients just feel when they have AML, they feel much worse than when they have MDS.
Well,
But
it's
I don't.
acute. It's acute myeloid leukemia. I mean, it's acute in
Yeah.
leukemia.
Leukemia is a lot more scary than syndrome.
And acute, I mean, it's
That's the other thing, by the way, we didn't talk about this, but one of the good things with the WHO 2022, so the differences even go to the names. So they formally recognize MDS as myelodysplastic neoplasms. So finally, we have the cancer name in MDS so that people don't call it anemia or syndrome or pre-leukemia or whatever. So it has while the ICC kept the syndrome. And again, I'm not sure, why is that the case?
Sanam, were you getting a lot of these second opinions, people sending you slides from various hospitals and say, hey, second opinion, we're not sure?
Not slides, but I have to say I still do. I get, questions where there's, like an NPM1 mutated case. How would you classify this? So I do, but where I get most of these are actually in my Twitter inbox, in my DMs. But yeah, I mean, especially in the beginning, I was getting a lot of questions. Now, not so much anymore. It's like very sporadic now, but in the beginning I was.
So, I mean, in summary, it seems to me that the field of HemePath, is coming together with one unified classification that's going to probably hit the ground in the next 1 to 2 years, maybe. And you all are embracing this, but there's no major clinical impact on this. This is purely helping standardizing how you report academically, how you interpret trials, and things of that nature. It's not going to affect your day-to-day practice pretty much. Is that fair?
Amer, do you want to go first?
No, I mean, I agree. And I think, again, back to my point that in my opinion, the most important thing is to have one standard classification. Actually, I'll give you a quick story. So, when these two classifications came out, like, again, many of us were not very happy with this. And within the International Consortium for MDS, we decided to go through an evidence-based approach to try to kind of, as Sanam said, there are like aspects in each classification that might be better than the other. But the problem is that you have two separate classifications. So we tried within a large database combined from Europe and the US, more than 7,000 patients, using very exhaustive statistical methods to try to come up with a harmonized system. And then the aspects that don't have the evidence, high-level evidence, we did like a formal modified Delphi consensus process using a large number of clinical and pathology experts. And we finally, after 2 years of work, we came up with a harmonized kind of proposal. And then when this was presented, one of the people kind of joked with us that, okay, so your solution to harmonizing having two classification is to introduce a third one. And I was like, this was not the whole goal is that to show that you can actually come up with one. If you ask me, I actually don't care which one, just pick one and and come up with it. But again, hopefully those were some of the things that really stimulated kind of things to move in the direction of one system.
But I think this was great, right? Because I think, papers like the ICMDS paper on MDS, this is what's going to be used to inform the new classification now. This data is going to inform the classification. And I think, people in every, area and field, including lymphoid and myeloid, did research projects and came up with data that is going to inform the future classification system. But to go back to your question, Shadi, I think for us, it is a little bit more relevant having, and it does impact our day-to-day practice, having a uniform classification, because, while I understand the broad implications may not be that relevant clinically, when I'm trying to sign out a report that is one patient report, remember, this is like a permanent official document that goes in the patient's chart, right? I want it to be correct. I want to be correct 100% of the times. I don't want, even if the nuances affect 5% or 10%, that's still a major thing for me, right? I don't want 10 of my reports, 10 out of 100 reports to be borderline confusing, right? I want them all to be right and accurate. And then I think the other thing is, we think about names and semantics, but I think these do have implications on, let's say, surveillance, right? If I call something an acute myeloid leukemia, insurance may pay in the future for that patient's MRD, NGS MRD, flow cytometry MRD. But if I call it MDS, insurance may not pay for the patient's, surveillance studies that may actually be needed for that patient. So I think if you think about the individual case by case, these things actually do matter. But of course, in the broad scheme of things, probably doesn't affect that many patients.
Sanam, I was going to tell you, if you want to be 100% accurate, just add some artificial intelligence. It's going to come your way, right?
I of course, and I look forward to that.
So this is very helpful. Maybe I missed certain things. Maybe I'll give you the floor, each one of you, just to any comments I may have forgot to mention, say anything that you want to share with listeners and viewers. I think this was, from where I sit, I thought this is a very important topic to bring forward to folks who listen and watch the show, because it did create a lot of chaos, honestly, when it first happened, and I felt this was an improvement, so it's important to share this. But anything we should have discussed that we may have not? Amer, you go first, and then Sanam.
No, I think we covered quite everything. I think the only aspect I want to cover is how social media can really help with some of this stuff, right? Social media in these days kind of bring a lot of headaches with everything that's going on. But I think on the medical clinical side, there is so much that, I learn because it's very tough to keep up on everything that's going on. And I think there was this group effort that I think was very organic and kind of a movement that pushed toward the unification and harmonization of these systems. And you could feel it when you look through Twitter, and and I think that was actually an important impetus to try to kind of get us back into one system. So I think it's very important that people kind of speak up when things don't seem to make most sense from a clinical perspective, and we work together, all the stakeholders, to come up with a system that makes most sense from a patient perspective.
Sanam.
I agree. I think, we covered everything. And I do want to say something, without sounding pretentious or disingenuous, I really do want to thank the people that made this unification happen, because I think it really impacts all of us in this community, and especially patients. And I think it took a lot of effort. It took people putting aside their egos, and it took, again, a lot of effort to do this. And I'm really, really grateful and thankful to everybody that contributed to this harmonization.
I'm not sure how much Healthcare Unfiltered contributed, but we played maybe 0 points. We just basically spread the word here. No, thank you so much, both of you. I know, believe me, I know how busy you are and how many directions you get pulled in. And I appreciate you coming on the show, and I look forward to seeing you both in Chicago very soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.